Morning, evening, everyone, wherever you're located at. My name is Johanna Siliakus, and I work with the Emerging Areas Transport Sector Office at the Asian Development Bank. And yes, so I would like to warmly welcome you to today's webinar, which is by Justin Cross on advancing e-mobility in ports and the maritime sector. So as you can hear from the title, as you will know, so today's webinar will take us to a transport mode that we have not really discussed much as part of this webinar series. So the maritime sector and waterborne transport, that is. As part of the series, we have generally explored e-mobility from a roads-based transport perspective. But an important modality, of course, for moving people and goods are vessels of different types. So today we'll hear about how the maritime sector can reduce its emissions, as well as what can be done at ports for supporting a transition to lower carbon shipping. And of course, you might have also noted that we are going a bit beyond e-mobility today. So due to the limitations relating to electrification of especially larger vessels used in the maritime sector, we have decided to go beyond e-mobility, as I mentioned, and we'll also discuss alternative fuels for reducing greenhouse gas emissions of the sector. At the same time, of course, electrification related solutions can be made use of in ports for reducing emissions, and we'll definitely also hear about those in today's webinar. And just a couple of more words from my side. So before I hand over to our moderator and speakers. So this webinar, as many of you will know, is organized under the umbrella of the e-mobility support and investment platform for Asia and the Pacific. This is a knowledge sharing platform which aims to build capacity and support the scale up of financing of e-mobility initiatives in the region. It's operated by ADB, co-implemented by UNEP and co-financed by the GEF, the Global Environment Facility. And if you would like to join the e-mobility community under the platform in order to stay up to date on our activities, please fill in the assessment survey in case you have not done so already. You can leave there your contact details, and you can see the QR code to that available on the screen. We'll also share a link in the chat in a bit. And our next webinar will take place in 2 weeks on the 19th of March. We will be looking at road freight electrification with case examples from the People's Republic of China with Qiyang Lu, who will be from ITDP in China. So we'll share the registration link to that webinar in the chat as well. But let me now hand over to our moderator. So Adele Samuels from our implementing partner Integrated Transport Planning will be moderating today's session. So Adele, over to you to guide us through the house rules and present the speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Johanna. Before introducing today's agenda and speaker, just a couple of words on the house rules. To ensure a smooth webinar session, please keep all microphones disabled. At the end of today's session, there will be some time for questions from the audience. Please send us your questions through the Q&A function that you will find available at the bottom of your screen. You can send through questions during the presentation, and we'll pick it up at the end of the session. In comparison to our webinar series last year, we've also extended the slot from 30 minutes to 45 minutes to ensure that we have sufficient time for a discussion at the end of the session. Also, please note that the webinar session is recorded and will be shared online. Going into the agenda for today, we have Justin Cross presenting on decarbonizing ports, followed by commentary from Dr. Robert Duncan McIntosh from ADB, and followed by a question and answer session at the end. Now, let me introduce you to our main speaker for today, which is Justin Cross. Justin is a port strategy planning and development consultant at Royal HaskoningDHV. Justin is a professional engineer and a PMP certified consultant with over 20 years of experience in maritime consultancy. He has a background in port and terminal planning, extensive experience in project management and delivery, and has spent the last 5 years focusing on greening of ports. At Royal HaskoningDHV, he drives sustainable and smart port solutions, having led major projects like the Save Port relocation and Samoa Green Port initiatives. As mentioned earlier, today we also have Dr. Robert Duncan McIntosh from Emerging Areas Group Transport Sector Office ADB, who would be providing his comments and ADB's perspective into maritime decarbonization right after Justin's presentation. Duncan McIntosh is the Senior Regional Maritime Specialist at ADB, leading maritime decarbonization and port connectivity strategies in Asia Pacific. He holds a PhD in maritime affairs and has expertise in climate services, oceanography, and maritime sustainability. Without further ado, I will hand over to Justin for his presentation. And just to remember that we do have a Q&A session at the end, so please send us your questions, even during the presentation is fine. Justin, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Adele. Thanks, Joanna. Thanks for the warm welcome. Welcome, everybody. I'll put my screen on, and then we'll get started. Okay, as mentioned, moving into the maritime sector for today's session. And as Joanna already mentioned, it goes beyond electrification, but I'll speak about the reasons for that in a moment. So we're going to be looking at electrification and alternative fuels, specifically focusing on how that helps to decarbonize the maritime sector. An introduction. There's essentially 6 parts to this presentation. I'll briefly start with some of the policy driving decarbonization in the maritime sector, and that's driven by the International Maritime Organization, IMO. From that policy, we'll have a look at how shipping lines are responding and taking the initiative to be ready to meet the challenges. We're going to have a look at what some of the experts think, how this is going to play out in the years ahead. We'll also have a look at how ports are responding. So what kind of infrastructure, what kind of services are they putting in place? There's a couple case studies that we'll touch on, and then we're going to come back to shore power just to finish it all off with some electrification examples and discussion. Starting off with the policy, International Maritime Organization, IMO. Back in 2018, based on their assessment, they found that the maritime sector is contributing almost 3% of global emissions, and that the tons of CO2 being produced was growing significantly, and there was something that needed to be done. An initial strategy came out in 2018, but that was then firmed up in 2023 with these 4 key pillars. So the first is around the shipping sector themselves, really emphasizing that there's an expectation that shipbuilding, ships need to become more efficient in their design, and that would be the first step. Within the maritime sector, looking at CO2 emissions, there's an expectation or a target that CO2 emissions should be reduced by at least 40% by 2030, and that's relative to 2008 levels. There's an expectation that the maritime sector should move towards zero or net zero emission technologies and fuels. And that then links to the 4th point, which is that by 2050, the expectation is that the maritime sector has reached net zero with regards to GHG emissions. How are shipping lines responding? Well, there are examples of electrification or uses of battery in shipping. And this is some articles from COSCO Shipping, where they've got a 700 TEU container vessel, which is launched in 2024. And it's a relatively small container vessel, 700 TEU. That would be the type that you would expect for short distances. And that's really one of the main limitations, is really that when you start looking at electrification, when you start looking at the use of battery power in shipping, it tends to be limited to relatively short distances. So the coastal shipping is not suitable yet for long distance international trips. But that's not the only way to deal with the challenge. We've got examples like CMA, CGM, the shipping line, who are looking towards LNG. And LNG is very much seen as a transition fuel within the maritime sector. It's not considered a long-term solution, but a lot of countries around the world, a lot of the port sector around the world are looking to use LNG, at least in the short to medium term, as a step towards a more sustainable solution. And as you can see in these articles, CMA, CGM, and these articles are going back a few years, they started investing in quite a few container vessels that are all powered by LNG. Looking more towards the future fuels, hydrogen-based fuels such as methanol, Maersk has shown that they believe that this is possibly one direction the future is going to take. Having, as you can see in that middle article, aiming for 19 dual-fuel methanol vessels this year. And in addition to that, then also signing contracts and agreements around the sourcing of methanol. So where are they actually going to get their methanol from? Where are they going to be bunkering? And more recently, ammonia starting to also feature in the vessel orders. This is NYK and NCL have both indicated that they are starting to deliver vessels that are ammonia ready or have ships that are on the order books. And I think it's worth mentioning that wind is obviously still very much a consideration. It's obviously proven, and there's various ways of harnessing wind. It's not just the old-fashioned sails. More efficient, cost-effective means of implementing wind power are now being tested and explored. So moving then on to what do the experts think? And this is from a publication from the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, where the expectation is very much that in the short term, biofuels will play a key role. But as we move more into the medium to long term, it is going to be hydrogen and specifically green hydrogen-based fuels that are going to be at the core of decarbonization efforts. And then the figure on the right-hand side, what that's showing is as you move from the year 2020 to the year 2050, the mix of fuels goes very much from heavy marine fuels in being the dominant fuel in 2020. By the time we get to 2050, the expectation that e-ammonia could be somewhere around 40 to 45% of the mix. Other fuels mentioned there include hydrogen, e-methanol, electricity with just a very thin sliver, and advanced biofuels and LNG still playing some kind of role. That then brings us to how are the ports responding, and we've got two examples here. So I'll start on the right-hand side with Port of Rotterdam, wanting to show that they are not contributing to emissions that will contribute to a temperature rise of more than 1.5 degrees. They've looked towards science-based targets to try and make sure that their initiatives, their actions can be verified, can be concluded as not contributing more than necessary. And they've developed their own greenhouse gas reduction strategy using SBTIs. From Singapore, what we see coming out of there is a decarbonization blueprint, and that looks towards 2050 and aligning with the IMO targets of not exceed or having a net zero greenhouse gas emissions by that date. And they've then come up with their own, in this decarbonization roadmap, their own 7 themes that they focus on. The first is looking at the port terminals and the various ways that they can decarbonize, including electrification of equipment. There's an LNG pilot project that's being trialed. and they're obviously looking at various clean alternative fuel options. From a harbour craft perspective, so these would be vessels that don't need to travel very far and would lend themselves towards electrification and the use of battery power. That's exactly what they're looking at. Under the marine fuels, they are not, as indicated in the IRENA graph, the expectation is that there's going to be a multi-fuel approach in the future. It's not going to be just a one fuel solution. The Port of Singapore is very much looking at it in the same way, that they will be able to provide bunkering of different types of fuels, and that they will, and as part of making sure that they're ready for that, a lot of it involves looking at the legal side, the safety side, putting those frameworks together and starting with the technology trials. Singapore has their own ships that are registered to Singapore, and there is an incentive for all vessels that are Singapore flagged to be meeting IMO targets, and that might be in the way of improved port dues or reduced port dues or other incentives such as prioritization. They look to collaborate on international platforms. So there are various organizations that are all actively trying to find ways and promote ways for decarbonization in the maritime sector. MPA Singapore is very much involved in those processes and making sure that they are part of the conversation. Research and development, making sure that they are investing back in their own people, that they understand what is important from a decarbonization perspective, what the opportunities are, and ensuring that they are scaling up internally. And finally, carbon awareness. So this also includes sustainability reporting and setting up a financial hub. So moving on then to a few case studies. I'm going to start with a small port out in the Pacific Ocean. This is Samoa Port Authority. And even though it's a small port, you can see the image on the right-hand side, even though it's a small port, they also realize that they have a role to play in terms of greening and adopting more energy efficient processes and essentially doing their bit to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It starts with a top-down approach from management, a commitment to decarbonization, a commitment towards essentially what we cover as a green port approach. So it's not only around decarbonization, but it's also in fact around things like waste management and those sorts of things. Some of the initiatives being implemented here, solar power to then reduce their reliance on the grid, and also looking at things like in the future moving towards alternative fuels or electrification of marine craft, and various other initiatives. Clean air or reduced air pollution is an important aspect. And this is over in the United States and Canada. There's the Northwest Seaport Alliance. So we've got 4 ports that have combined efforts to look at how they can actively reduce emissions. This project has included investing into trucks, replacing diesel trucks with more efficient and trucks and with electric or alternative fuel trucks, but also then making sure that they providing the shore power, the electricity connections needed in the ports, so that vessels that are calling at the ports can plug in and don't need to use their auxiliary engines in port. I'll get onto that in a moment as well. Still in the States, in Port Elizabeth, APM Terminals has been investing in their terminal equipment, replacing diesel equipment with electric models. And they've also made sure that all of that is being powered by 100% renewable energy. Over in Europe, in Port of Rotterdam, they are in the process of developing a hydrogen hub. So this is a facility that will produce hydrogen, it will store hydrogen, it will distribute hydrogen to end users. It will also be used for the production of alternative fuels such as ammonia. It's a highly complex and project, and will take a good decade to fully implement. And obviously what that means is there's a number of studies that need to be undertaken. There's a number of policies and agreements that need to be put in place before a lot of this can be realized. And then returning back to the region, this is in Vietnam, and this is a project that's in the process of being developed. Gemlink, together with their partner CMA CGM, already has a container terminal, and they are now in discussions and moving forward with Nike, who is going to be using electric barges to get the containers from their factories upstream down to the terminal, and essentially creating or paving the way for a green corridor between Vietnam and the end receivers of these goods, whether they be in the States or Europe or wherever. So I'm going to come back now to shore power. And why is shore power important? Maybe just to realizing that this webinar series has mostly been focused on road transport, maybe good just to mention what is shore power. So it's the provision of electricity at the berth to a vessel so that it can switch off its main and auxiliary engines. And then through that way, we're improving air quality in the port. Some of the ports we visit, this is what shore power is shown as. It's a small distribution board providing electricity to marine craft. It will be standard electricity as you have in your home. But this is also shore power. This is a cruise vessel on the right-hand side, and this would be probably an 11 kV connection, 60 hertz. It's not the type of electricity you find at home. This is a far more sophisticated and complex electricity provision. The reason I put this slide up is there tends to be some discussion, or there tends to be an impression within the maritime sector that if we are delivering the photo on the left at our port, that we've provided shore power and we've ticked the box. But I think the real question then is, well, to what extent is that vessel contributing towards air emissions? To what extent are we really solving the problem? Whereas if we go over to the right-hand side, where we're really dealing with the large vessels, where we're really making an impact, is that really a better solution for shore power? One of the challenges that exists, though, is around standardization. So there is one international standard relating to shore power, and it's this document here. And it covers high voltage connection, shore power connections in port. The challenge, though, is that it really only covers cruise and container terminals from a standardization perspective. So if you have these systems in place and you have cruise and container vessels calling, you know that your installation is going to be able to support them in most cases. For other ship types, there is no standardization in terms of what the electrical connection is going to look like. The challenge that ports then face is having to then assess what do all the different vessels that are calling at their port, what are their needs, what are their requirements, and what type of provision or electrical supply provision would be needed to be able to provide them with shore power, to provide them with electricity. One final slide, and this is around policy influencing shore power provision. So Port of Los Angeles, or Los Angeles is the state actually, implemented a comprehensive policy through what they call the Alternative Maritime Power Program. So already from 2007, they've been requiring that vessels switch off their auxiliary diesel engines when in port, and this regulation applies to container cruise and refrigerated cargo vessels. So you can see then the connection between the previous standard, where container and cruise vessels are covered, and this requirement from CARB. But as of this year, the CARB requirements are extending to roll-on, roll-off vehicle carriers, and tanker vessels. Also, interesting to see that with this policy in place, the ports cannot operate unless they have the necessary infrastructure in place. And what that has meant is that the port has more alternative marine power infrastructure in place than any other port globally. Okay, that's our presentation for today. I look forward to the discussion with Duncan and your questions.
Thank you, Justin, for that enlightened presentation on how we decarbonize ports and enhancing our understanding of that important topic, as well as mine personally. I'll now hand over to Dr. Robert Duncan McIntosh for some commentary and discussion. Over to you, Duncan.
Thanks very much, Adele. Thanks, Justin, for a very comprehensive presentation. We covered a lot of options that our ports and our countries can take to green and decarbonize their maritime sector, ports and vessels included. And this aligns quite well with ADB's recently launched flagship that is the Maritime Decarbonization Initiative. And this was launched just last November at COP29 in Azerbaijan. So with this initiative, ADB is aiming to take a programmatic approach to many of the initiatives that Justin outlined today. So from energy efficiency, renewable energy, electrification at the port, also including domestic fleets that would include harborcraft, inland waterway vessels. We saw the example of the electric inland waterway barges in Vietnam. So a lot of these are projects that ADB would like to expand into. It's still somewhat of an emerging area at ADB, doing these types of projects. But one of the bullet points under ADB's Maritime Decarbonization Initiative is the launching of a new multi-donor trust fund at ADB, tentatively titled the Green Ports and Maritime Decarbonization Fund. So this fund will be formally launched this year in May at ADB's annual general meeting in Milan. So under the initiative, we hope that we will be able to fund a wide array of these types of projects to help our developing member countries ensure a just transition as this critical transport sector undergoes a energy transition from fossil fuels to cleaner energy sources. And we do expect, as Justin mentioned, that a lot of the impetus for this change is going to be driven by the regulations coming from the IMO. So as Justin pointed out, the IMO has set a new revised greenhouse gas strategy for achieving net zero at or near 2050. And that includes interim targets at 2030 and 2040. And it's mostly because of the interim targets that we expect there will be a need for LNG as transition fuel. However, we don't want to invest too much in what will ultimately become a stranded asset. So we are very supportive of the electrofuels that Justin mentioned, the methanol, ammonia, and hydrogen. However, right now, there is a price premium, of course, for any of these fuels. Not only are they less energy dense than fossil fuels, but they cost more. And some of our member countries, in particular, our small island developing states, for example, those out in the remote Pacific, already pay some of the highest prices for shipping their goods in and out of their countries. And we've heard from just recently the Republic of the Marshall Islands explaining how much they pay for imported food that mostly comes to them by ship. And in today's shipping scenario, using fossil fuels, which are much cheaper than any of these electrofuels, they're already paying more than most others and they have a income level lower than the rest of the world. So how can they afford to pay this premium? As we transition to these future fuels, we're thinking about who is going to shoulder that premium. And one of the interesting things that Marshall Islands has done is they have recently launched a sailing vessel, the Jurin I. And it's not only a low carbon vessel because it primarily operates under sail, but without the need to purchase much fuel, it's also a cheaper means of transporting their goods inter-island. So they're looking at scaling that up and potentially benefiting from the use of some of those low-cost technologies to not only cut the emissions, but also cut the cost of their shipping. But as we think about how are we going to level the playing field here so that everybody can benefit from this transition, we're watching closely the negotiations taking place next month at the IMO's Marine Environmental Protection Committee meeting, where there's a lot of talk around the potential for a universal carbon levy to be passed this year. And should that happen, that would become the world's first universally applicable carbon levy. So that could potentially catapult shipping from a laggard in terms of climate mitigation to essentially a leading sector, because there is no, as we speak, universal globally accepted carbon levy. So the IMO right now is really moving fast, and some of that ambition is being led by some of our ADB member countries in the Pacific. RMI and Fiji are members of the Six-Pack Plus that have been very vocal. So we're watching closely the outcome from this MEPC meeting at the IMO, as we expect that will really provide an impetus for investment. And ADB wants to be ready to support those investments to ensure that not only the wealthy countries are benefiting from this transition, but that we see economic benefits in ADB's developing member countries as well. So with that, maybe I see there's some questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to those. I will just pose my own first while I have the floor to Justin. Very broadly, a number of our countries are interested in what we're talking about here. I've heard it come to my desk. I hear it from my ADB country-based colleagues. There are a number of interested countries, and often the question is, where should they start? You've outlined a lot of initiatives here, everything from electrifying the port, some things you haven't even had the time to touch on, like the smart and automated digital systems at the ports that can be implemented, the vessels themselves, domestic fleets, inter-island ferries, harbor craft. There's alternative fuels. There's so much for our country to consider. I guess I would ask Justin, what's your recommendation for where should our client countries begin in terms of prioritizing their first steps to not just making a policy, a green port policy, but actually investing beyond that into some changes in their infrastructure or their vessels? Where should they begin? Over to you, Justin. Thank you.
That's a great question to start with, Duncan. It's a nice, tricky one. I think what we see is that when you start looking at the projects that ports want to invest in, there's always the question of where's the money going to come from. And generally what we see is there's a lot of interest in PPP. Can you make it attractive to the private sector? Can you bring them in? Can you make it bring them on board? So once they've got their policy in place, and their policy should be descriptive, it should be very clear in terms of what the expectations are from the maritime sector, from the ports. It shouldn't be vague. There needs to be very clear targets, very clear actions outlined in their policies. I think one of the things that we see is that sometimes policies are too vague. So it does start with the policy. It does start with having a very clear policy, a very clear set of expectations. With those policies, with those expectations, developing a pipeline of projects, identifying how you're going to achieve the targets that have been set, the KPIs that have been set, and then working out, well, does it make sense for the port to be investing in this? Does it make sense for government support to be coming in, or does it make sense to be bringing in the private sector? So there is a bit of it's very much a planning exercise, but it starts with having a good policy. It then starts with having a clear idea of what targets you're trying to achieve, what the projects look like to achieve those targets, and who's going to then be brought on board to be part of that project.
Thank you, Duncan and Justin. Yeah, quite an insightful discussion. I see we do have some questions from the audience. So the first one is from Dan Millison. So no mention of small modular nuclear reactors in the discussion of alternative fuels, but some SMR development is specifically for long distance shipping, IMO compliance. What do the experts think? So Justin,
I think Mark, I see Mark has indicated he would like to answer this question. I'm not sure if that was correct or not, Mark, but if you'd like to answer that, that's fine. Otherwise, I'm happy to jump in.
No, I think it's relating to.
I just clicked the answer live.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Well, then, in response to the question, indeed, I think it starts off by saying there's going to be a multifaceted approach to fuels. So it's not only the fuels that we're listed. The expectation is that the industry is going to be looking across a broad range of options, and indeed, small nuclear reactors will form one of the options going forward. In the sort of the expert opinion that I presented, that did come from IRENA, so that is a renewable energy association. So obviously, nuclear not being a renewable energy source does not really feature high on their expectations. And I think that's also part of the answer, is that there is an expectation that we're trying to move more towards renewable sources, sustainable, long-term sustainable solutions. And nuclear may indeed form a solution, and it may indeed form part of a transition solution. I think also there's obviously challenges around nuclear from some countries in terms of what is and is not possible, and that will also come into play.
That's right. I'll just also throw in that ADB would be limited in our ability to invest in nuclear. So technically, it's certainly clean as far as carbon. Justin points out it's not technically renewable, but it is very clean, no carbon. But ADB would be limited in our ability there, and I don't think at this stage we would be able to support investments in nuclear.
Thank you, Duncan. We've got another question from Lloyd Wright. Are there any examples of major ports using solar or photovoltaic panels over port properties to self-generate power?
Yes, this is probably the sort of the easy first step in terms of decarbonisation for ports, and it can start with small initiatives such as just lighting towers, putting solar PV on your lighting towers in your port, but obviously you're quite limited in terms of how much electricity you're going to generate that way. The next step is then to look at the buildings throughout your port and what you can generate by putting solar PV on your buildings. The challenge you'll see that most port space, and specifically container terminals is really one of the areas where we see these initiatives being driven, is that the amount of footprint that the buildings occupy or that provide, and what that means in terms of solar PV opportunity does not necessarily or does not often cover the electricity demand of the port, especially if they're handling large volumes of reefer containers, which are quite energy hungry. They are going to still fall short of their energy demand. So it is a first step, but it's not, unfortunately, generally proving to be the solution for most ports, not in terms of reaching 100% of their own generation.
Thanks, Justin. Duncan, do you have any comments on this question, or can I move on to the next one?
We can move to the next one.
Thank you. Oh, so we have another question from Dan Millison. No, sorry. There's a few. So no mention of possible carbon credit transactions. One of the big announcements at COP29 was that Paris Article 6 carbon markets are operational. Anything in the pipeline for ADB to facilitate carbon credit co-financing for ports and maritime GHG emissions? So I think, Duncan, that's for you.
Sure. At this point, I think we would need to wait to see if a carbon levy gets agreed upon by the IMO, and that will, of course, take a couple years to roll out. But that's certainly within the modalities that ADB could finance. But at this point, there needs to be a level playing field, and there is no universal carbon levy yet. That would include all of our member countries. So certainly possible in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Duncan. Justin, any input from your side, or can I go on to the next question?
The next one, thanks, Adele.
Thanks, Justin. Okay. Oh, we have another question from Saviwe Mabija. Energy transition in the shipping industry is easier on newer ships, but what is the impact on the existing older fleet? That's the first question. Is there engine market growing to meet this energy transition demand? Example, are there sufficient ammonia-enabled engines to deal with the changes to ammonia, and similarly for methanol, H2, etc.? Also, is the refitting cost going to slow the pace of decarbonization of the existing fleet? Will this cost be transferred to the freight movers? The premise of this is South Africa. We saw with the effect of IMO regulations in refinery space that 4 of the 6 refineries closed due to the retrofitting cost. So that's a two-part question. Yeah. Justin, I think that's for you.
So I think, as I mentioned in the section from Irina, in the short term, their expectation is that biofuels will be the main fuel to pick up, and the reason for this is that biofuels can be a drop-in fuel. So you can combine it with a lot of your vessels that are currently operating. They don't need to go through major retrofits. It's a relatively simple solution, but it does still mean that they are still using a large amount of marine fuel, but just to a lesser extent. Retrofitting, as you indicate, is an expensive option, and realistically, it's probably not the route most vessels are going to take. More likely, we're waiting for vessels to be phased out, and there's newer vessels to come in, and hopefully then with the ability to use ammonia or methanol or some other alternative fuel. Is it going to slow the pace of decarbonization? It may very well. I think what we see is that there's a push to try and extend the life of vessels as much as possible. Generally, a vessel probably has a life of 20, 25 years, and we see a lot of vessels that are being pushed to 30 or 40 years. So indeed, I think it could delay it. But I think then there's also other parts of the IMO regulation, or the IMO targets, that ship owners need to think about. The very first one is around improving design and trying to make vessels more efficient. So vessels can put scrubbers in place to reduce the emissions. There are various other physical aspects that could be implemented to try and contribute towards decarbonization. So it's not only about the fuels.
Thanks, Justin. Duncan, is there anything from your side?
Yeah, the question about the cost of retrofitting, and I'll also throw in the additional cost of the more expensive fuels. Is this going to slow the pace of decarbonization? And I think this is why the answer depends on not only when we get a carbon levy, but what that price will be. So there's talk everywhere from $50 to $150 a ton of carbon. So shipping is a business, first and foremost. So the ship owners are going to do the cost benefit analysis. And as Justin said, they're going to hang on to their existing fleet as long as it's economical. Only when the cost of running those heavy fuel oil engines exceeds the cost of retrofitting or replacing the fleet, according to calculations of the expected cost of these new fuels, then will they make the switch. So the switch is going to happen. A lot of the vessels currently on order, we'll see a higher and higher percentage of those be dual fuel or e-fuel vessels. And so we expect the pace of early retirement of existing fleet to pick up, especially if and when we get this carbon levy at a higher price. The carbon levy, the more accelerated that will be.
Thank you, Duncan. I'm conscious of time, so there are a few questions. If we're happy to run through them, let me know. Duncan, Justin, is that okay? I think we can spare 5 or 10 minutes just to go through some of them. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
So we have another question from Dan Wilson. Could carbon credits be used to offset the IMO's envisioned carbon levy, or is that not on the table?
Yeah, very quickly, we have to wait and see what happens with the carbon levy. So I think we touched on that already. Thanks.
Brendan Coleman has a question. Are vessels generally already biofuel ready at low blending levels? So that's his question.
I believe the answer is yes, generally yes.
Okay, moving on. Julia Hollingall, how feasible in terms of cost and technical readiness are options to decarbonize smaller vessels, banana boats, combined with solar on outer islands where fuel transport costs are high?
One example from the Marshall Islands, they essentially revitalized their sailing proas, which are small sailing canoes for intra-lagoon transport. So within these big lagoons, they had a tradition of sailing proas that was essentially dying out and being replaced with outboard style banana boats. So part of a recent project that also built the Jura sailing inter-island vessel was to revitalize these small sailing proas, these small sailing canoes within the lagoon. So that's one option. They can potentially be electrified, and maybe Justin has some thoughts.
Justin, please.
I was just going to say wind.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, moving to the next question. Brendan Coleman, what's the level of competitiveness for electrification of carbotage or short shipping routes?
Level of competitiveness. I'm not sure what's meant by the level of competitiveness, but definitely short shipping routes, we are seeing an interest in electrification. And the two examples that were presented, so COSCO with their 700 TEU container vessel, which is very much a coastal shipping vessel, and then the example from Gemalink of the electric barges. I think where it gets driven, where the drive is coming from at the moment is the talk, as I said, of green shipping corridors. Can suppliers, can producers show that they are contributing towards green shipping corridors? So, for instance, in the case of Gemalink, Nike very much wants to be able to transport their goods along an entire route in a net zero way, and having this electric barge contributes to that.
Thank you, Duncan. Moving on to the next question. Mahir Sorti, question for Duncan. Does ADB plan to support scaling up of proof of concept vessel for RMI or for other PBSP countries through loans grants?
Yes, that is something we're looking at. And I've spoken with some of the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership members, the Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport, and the designers of that vessel, the Jura. And so they've learned some lessons from that initial design that they would like to improve upon if it were to be replicated. We have seen interest coming from some nearby countries, including Kiribati and FSM, to potentially scale this up. So we are looking into that. Thanks.
Thanks, Duncan. Moving on to the next question. Pooja Shahab, there is a lot of backlash on biofuels such as usage of ADB oil. What is your take on it? Also, in the dry bulk sector, number of new buildings supporting methanol is almost 3 times the number of ammonia dual-fitted vessel. Do you also feel methanol is the future fuel? Is there anything in the pipeline that ADB is looking to support member countries in that development? So Duncan, I think that one's for you.
Okay. There's quite a lot in that.
Yeah.
Biofuel, the backlash on biofuels, I think is totally understandable. I think when large parts of the world's population are starving and we're using fuels to edible fuels for transport, there's going to be a backlash. Having said that, it is one way to decarbonize. So it's a complicated issue, and I'm not going to weigh in on it one way or the other, but just to acknowledge that it is a very complicated issue, and that biofuels, while they provide a solution, there is a question: are we then depriving people of food? That's fine. I agree that there's a challenge there. The dry bulk sector producing almost 3 times more methanol vessels than ammonia vessels. I'm not sure where those numbers come from. So Pooja, I'd be very interested if you could share some of that information, some of your background on that with me. But just to say, in the second part of your question, where you say, do you feel methanol is the future fuel? I definitely think it's part of the mix. I definitely think it will be one of the fuels, and we see it. For instance, with Maersk investing in methanol vessels. But I don't think it's the only. It's not going to be the only fuel that vessels look to. And then I see there's a final question for Duncan.
Thanks, Justin. So agree with what Justin's already mentioned. And is there anything ADB is looking to support? So yes, there is. Now, this is where we get into private sector lending, non-sovereign. And so that's where we are also looking to expand. So we do have an interesting potential project in the pipeline. We have a private ship management company that is interested in purchasing a fleet of methanol vessels. So we may analyze that as a potential deal. So this is something that is new for ADB. We've done a bit of work at the sovereign side in the ports, and occasionally touched on domestic fleets, inter-island ferries we recently replaced in Tuvalu. But a non-sovereign private ship-owning company looking to us for some blended finance is something that I see a lot of potential for, and we're just now beginning to scratch the surface. But yes, these are deals that our private sector operations department is beginning to look into.
Thanks, Justin and Duncan. I think we've reached the end of the questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. A special thank you to Justin and Duncan as well. We will share the recording with all the registered participants as soon as possible, and we hope to see you at our next webinar on the 19th of March. Have a lovely day further, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.